Hi, everyone. This is Doug. This is a second part of Maccoby. It's more of a digression, if you will, to go into a little more depth what he was talking about in the first part, which is from Acts 21:21. And this is where Paul is asked by James and says, we have heard rumors that you're guilty of apostasy. And that's the actual word he uses. And that's a Greek word, but it's also a loan word into Hebraisms. Anyway, so Paul, in this article or this section of the Mythmaker book by Hyam Maccoby, he's basically described by Maccoby as a deceptive spiritual weakling with the 12 and James. He just can't, he has to buckle under to them. He doesn't have any strength of character to fight them, claiming, it's the exact opposite of the person you see in the epistles to Galatians. He's brave and he talks about super apostles, and I spoke up to Peter and I put him in his place and all this stuff. But when he's in front of all these people, he's a weakling. So you really have to keep that in mind when you are reading Galatians. Did these events really happen the way Paul relates it, or are we seeing the real Paul in Acts? And we're going to see in Acts, Paul is given several specific commands to do something that would prove that he keeps the law. And here was Paul's golden moment where he could have told James, go screw yourself. I don't have to do the law. None of us had to do the law. And you Jews who want to follow the law, you're going the wrong path, and you don't even deserve eternal life. That's what he told the Jews of Pisidia in the city of a small town of Antioch in Asia Minor. And that's in Acts 13, verse 46 and 47, if you don't know what I'm talking about. So let's take a look at this. But before we do, I want to just show you something that's kind of funny. See that picture on the right? Every time I've used it, people go, oh my gosh, you just use horrible pictures of Paul. But you know what? Paul's character came through his face, because this is a complimentary painting by Albert Dürer, a friend of Paul, a lover of Paul, a lover of Luther. And he gave this as a painting of Paul to make Luther feel better. Here's your buddy. But this is what he looks like when you follow the description by Onesiphorus in the Aquila and Thecla, a book about Paul and his activities that was recorded by other people in a social book, meaning a non-canonical type book. But anyway, this was in a painting called The Four Apostles. So this was clearly crediting Paul as an apostle, treating him with honor. But the fact is, Paul is just, his character comes through here. You look at this guy and he looks deceptive, right? Exactly. This is not a painting made by somebody who didn't like Paul. This is Paul's true character. Somehow, thank the Lord, comes through in the picture. But now you're going to see it's going to come through actual letters on the page. And if you love Paul now, you need to still be objective enough to say, you know what? If Paul isn't really the real deal, I want to know. And if Paul is being deceptive with the 12 and Luke has no clue that Paul is the opposite of what he's seeing and doing, Luke is just trying to defend him in an appeal before Caesar Nero, and writing Theophilus as judge who's helping Caesar Nero. But Luke has no clue that Paul is the person who tells you the Lord is gone and it's nothing to be worried about, and just believe, and you're going to go to heaven. Now, let's just go on. This is where Hyam Maccoby talks about the issue about Paul's variability, his ability to mold himself to whoever he's with. This is not a good thing, my friends. This is a person who's literally extolling manipulation and lying and deceiving people to think you believe something other than you do. It's not just being silent about what you believe, but affirmatively acting inconsistent with what you believe. And that's what Paul does. And he even tells you he's acting inconsistent with how he truly believes. Let's listen to this. Hyam Maccoby is talking about Paul, page 151 of his book, The Mythmaker. Paul seems to have been quite willing to use a considerable amount of deception in his relations with Jerusalem, the 12 apostles, and James, and to have done his best to reassure Jerusalem of his loyalty to Judaism, while at the same time, as his epistles show clearly, teaching his new converts that the Torah was now entirely obsolete. Yeah, like gone, zero. Paul himself proclaims his policy of adapting his tone to his audience and affirmatively hiding, misleading his anti-Torah beliefs from those who were loyal to the Torah. And this is what Paul says This quote here is from 1 Corinthians 9, verses 20 to 22. To Jews, I became like a Jew, or you could actually translate it, I pretended to be like a Jew, to win Jews, as they are subject to the law of Moses. I put myself under the law to win them, although I am not myself subject to it. I'm not under the law, as others translate it. To win Gentiles who are outside the law, I made myself like one of them. I pretended to be like one of them. Although I am not in truth outside God's law, being under the law of Christ. We don't know what that means, but he says many times, twice, he says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient. So apparently, if the costs outweigh the benefits, if it's more expedient, he will obey the law. But otherwise, if it's not expedient, he doesn't have to. To the weak, I became weak. So if he's people who are weak are people who believe you shouldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols or meat that has blood in it. He makes that very clear in Romans. To the weak, I became weak. So he would just around them not eat that kind of food to win the weak. So why don't you just tell the weak, wait a minute, you're just worrying about something you don't need to worry about. Unclean foods, meat sacrificed to idols, that's okay. Why does he just say what he really believes to everybody? Why doesn't he have one consistent view? Indeed, I have become everything to turn men of every sort, so that in one way or another I may save some. In another passage, it says, "I'm all things to all people." He's a people pleaser, and he's not concealing this to special converts who he trusts, and that's what he's doing here in 1 Corinthians. But not to others. The others he needs to deceive because he can't just come out and tell them what he really believes. Now, I want to focus on this passage because this is where Maccoby is going to say Paul is clearly misleading the 12 and clearly a weakling, a spiritual weakling. So listen to this and you judge yourselves. Paul is come into Jerusalem for the Pentecost and there's all kinds of celebrations going on. But now the 12 want to talk to him. And James, the leader, the bishop, comes up to him and says the following. But they, the elders and the disciples in Jerusalem, meaning the 12 and the others who were associated with the 12. But they were told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to apostatize. We'll get into that in a second. Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children and not to walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? I want to tell you what this word apostasy is. It's apostasian. It comes from a word meaning defection. Apostasy, revolt. The feminine of the same as apostasion, defection from truth. Now, you should have heard the word apostasy in your lifetime as a Christian somewhere, because the word apostasy is the word that translates inside of Deuteronomy 13 about any false prophet who comes, even if they have signs and wonders, miracles, prophecies that come to pass, that if they ever try to turn you away from keeping God's law, this is talking primarily about the 10 Commandments, Shabbat, things like that. If they try to turn you away from this law, you must reject them. You must not only reject them, you must kill them. You must execute them, put them on trial, and have them killed. So this is not a charge. This apostasy charge is extremely serious. So Paul could be brave and say, you know what? I know from Jesus Christ, from heaven, I had these visions. They're in my head all the time, and he's telling me the law is done away with, and I can't be tried and killed for apostasy, and that they'll believe me. But Paul's already found out the 12 don't believe him. You got to go back to Acts 9 when Paul goes there and the disciples did not believe Paul had actually met Jesus. Immediately after his experience on the road to Damascus, he went to Jerusalem. So the Damascus account is in Acts 9, verse 5, 6. It begins there. And now by verse 26, Paul has decided to come to Jerusalem and repent back to these people. And guess what? Verse 26, when he came to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing he was a disciple. And read the whole account. It never changes from this perspective. It goes later in saying that there was a coming, going in and out in common, but they did not say he and them were fellowshipping in any way. There was still this iciness going on. And wait till you hear what Paul's Jesus said. Paul says the same thing. They won't believe you really met me. How can this be if this is really Jesus and he appeared on a road to Damascus? You think about that. Think about that as I read this next verse. Now, what had Jesus told Paul originally when Paul decided to go to Jerusalem? He beelined, took him probably 2 weeks to walk this distance, but he beelined from Damascus all the way to Jerusalem, and he wanted to apologize to the 12. And Paul explains all this to his Jesus, and his Jesus is going to say, no, you can't do what you want to do. You can't go see the 12. Okay, that's how this ends, this encounter. I'm going to show you right here. This encounter is recounted by Paul in front of a large audience in a mini trial he's having at the temple, and he's telling everyone this story, how he beelined from Damascus to Jerusalem immediately after the experience. And he came to Jerusalem, and he's in a prayer, and he's in a trance at the temple. It's basically he's on the floor, but he's not able to move anymore, right? That's a trance. And I saw him, Jesus, saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. So his Jesus was convinced the 12 would not accept him. And exactly what Paul was told not to do, he did anyway, even though Jesus told him, don't go see them. Jesus never changed his position in Acts 20, the count version in Acts 22. And so when Paul gets to Jerusalem, that's exactly what happens. They were all afraid of him and not believing he was a disciple. So Paul's Jesus did not have any ability to even influence the 12. What kind of Jesus is this, by the way, who can't appear to them miraculously in Jerusalem in a pillar of light when he could appear in a pillar of light just 2 weeks earlier to Paul to convince him that I'm the real Jesus? And why would they reject that Paul had been a disciple of Jesus? They didn't believe anything he said. And keep reading all the way to the end of Acts 9:26, this passage. Paul never speaks. They don't know what his point of view is because he's a weakling. He's a spiritual weakling. He knows his story doesn't have any weight. No matter what you want to believe, a story of someone claiming I got blinded on the road. Anybody can fake a blindness. The people with you, they don't have any names. There's no witnesses to what happened on that road, and yet everything depends on us believing this. I think these disciples did the right thing. Paul attempted to join them, and they were all afraid of him, and they did not believe he was a disciple. And his own Jesus said, get out of Jerusalem because they won't believe your testimony about me. He knew he couldn't convince them. Paul couldn't convince them. He was a spiritual weakling. He had no guts. He couldn't take the chance of just telling them the truth. I just don't know what happened on the road to Damascus. It didn't maybe really even happen. Maybe that's what the truth is. But he didn't have the guts to just tell them, I don't really know. And he didn't have the guts to tell them he's not allowed to even say what Jesus tells him on the road to Damascus or any time subsequent. He says clearly in Second Corinthians 12 verses 3-7, he says, all my revelations come from Jesus in the third heaven, but I'm not allowed to tell you. It's illegal for me to tell you anything he tells me. That's why you don't hear any quotes of Paul quoting Jesus in any of his epistles. They're all him speaking, but not Jesus being quoted, or even God Yahweh being quoted talking to Paul. Paul is this loner who has absolutely no spiritual guts to even say what Jesus said, and using the excuse that he can't tell you because it's illegal. It's against the law for me to tell you what Jesus talks to me about in the third heaven. Can you believe this, my friends? And that's the account you're willing to accept. Oh, it's just so obvious that the reason why Paul's a spiritual weakling around the 12, as we'll see in Acts 21, we haven't gotten there yet, is because he has no legs to stand on. In other words, he knows there's no truth to anything he's saying. Spiritual weakness means you don't have any spiritual strength. You don't have any connection to Jesus. Your Jesus doesn't even have enough strength to even convince the 12 by any miracles he allegedly gave you. It just doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. It's obvious this man did not meet Jesus Christ. Our Jesus could have absolutely convinced the 12. And here you can see they don't believe he really met them. Right? All right. So now let's take a look at the passage that Mr. Maccoby in the Mythmaker says proves Paul is a weakling, a spiritual weakling around the 12, and James, which proves he's a coward. He doesn't actually hold any views that are strong enough to say, I believe this and I believe that. He is simply a strategist, a manipulator, a deceiver. And that is a sign of a weak spiritual person, not someone you want to follow. Let's watch and see. This is real time. This is Luke, a friendly voice who thinks Paul's for real as a real person. But he has a totally different view of Paul than you do. If you're a Pauline Christian, you think he's anti-law. Paul's anti-law, and not in the book of Acts. He's pro-law and he's pro-works-worthy repentance, as we'll get into later. Mountsy, reverse interlinear, Acts 21, verses 21 to 24. But they were told about you. This is James telling Paul that the disciples, the leadership here at Jerusalem, have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to apostatize. That means what? It means a defection, apostasy, revolt, feminine of the same as apostasy and defection from truth. It's the same as the crime of Deuteronomy 13 I already talked about. Telling them not to circumcise their children and not to walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? He then says, he gives them all these commands. So I put a red line on all of the commands given by Bishop James. So Bishop James is got guts, strength, spiritual vigor, and he's telling them what he's got to do to fix this so that nobody will get the idea that you are not following the law. And he's going to say that's exactly why you're going to do what I'm telling you to do. And he should have been a hero and said, no, I don't believe in the law. It's gone. It's a different dispensation. I'm the new guy. I'm the new sheriff in town. But he doesn't have the spiritual vigor, the spiritual strength to say any of these things. Paul is silent as a lamb. They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. There are with us 4 men who have taken themselves a vow. Take these men and purify yourselves along with them and pay their expenses that they may shave their heads. And everyone will know. Who? Everyone outside of us, the 12, everybody will all know that there is nothing in what we have been told about you, that you're an apostate, but that you yourself will walk keeping the law. So this was Paul's chance to say, nope, I'm not going to keep the law. The law is dead and gone. It doesn't apply to me. I'm not subject to it. I'm not going to play a pretense here with you. I'm going to tell you the truth. But he doesn't do that. He does exactly what he was told. Watch this. Then Paul took the men, and on the next day he purified himself with them and went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification. This is all in the chapter 6 of the book of Numbers in the Torah. At which time the sacrifice would be offered on behalf of each one of them. So he's actually offering sacrifices in the pre-70 AD fall of the temple. All right, so now it's set up for you to read what Maccoby says and shows you how weak spiritually this Paul was to do and go along with all this stuff. Okay, so Maccoby says, so far, the break between Paul and the Jerusalem leadership was only on a personal level of a quarrel between Paul and Peter. So he's referring to Galatians chapter 2, verse 9 and verse 11. Later came the final and decisive break in which Paul was officially repudiated by the Jerusalem movement as a whole. Now, that's what Bishop Ambrose was referring to, and he, Mr. Maccoby, figured it out just as we presented it to you. There is ample evidence in Paul's epistle to the Galatians and also in his 2 epistles to the Corinthians that in the years following his quarrel with Peter, he had to face continual opposition from emissaries of the Jerusalem church, who were sent out by James and Peter to counteract Paul's teaching about the abrogation of the Torah. Moreover, it appears that Paul had to defend himself frequently from the charge of being without true authority of his teaching, since he had no direct personal link with the historical Jesus. And you can see that's the immediate reaction of the disciples in Acts 9, right? Right after Paul comes from Damascus. And Jesus of Paul says that's going to be what's going to happen. Nobody's going to believe you actually met me. They're not going to believe your testimony about me. And we never see where they said, oh, we agree with his testimony. They never do that. And in fact, to the opposite, if you really pay attention to what Luke is doing in the gospel, he never says he agrees with it. He's just reporting what Paul says his Jesus said. But Paul's Jesus never says Paul's going to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, right? He never says that. He had 3 chances, Paul, to say that. That's in Acts 9, 22, and 26. In none of those 3 chapters, you will find any mention that Paul was called an apostle by Jesus Christ. Let's continue. Moreover, it appears that Paul had to defend himself frequently from the charge of being without true authority of his teaching, since he had no direct personal link with historical Jesus, but relied only on visions which were of doubtful validity. Of course they were doubtful. Even it makes no sense that Jesus in Acts 22 is relating, it's related by Paul, but it's an event that occurred prior to the Acts 9, or at the time of Paul rushing from Damascus to Jerusalem, and his Jesus saying, they won't believe you met me. That is a definite sign this is not the real Jesus, right? Because the real Jesus could have convinced the 12 easily if he was the real Jesus, right? Just even in prayer or in, another vision, but that never happens. Instead, Jesus allowing the 12 to be tested, and their conclusion was conclusively that Paul is not a true disciple of Jesus Christ. And it says so in Acts 9, and it's clear. Jesus of Paul even says that's going to happen. They don't believe you. They will not believe your testimony about me. This is a fundamental block on anybody who wants to claim Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ, and everybody knew it. No, nobody knew it, and nobody accepted it. But they were nice to him. They're polite to him, and they, if he's going to preach Jesus, they're not going to stop him. See, you got to use your common sense. They're doing the right thing. We don't have to stop him unless he's doing something wrong, and we don't know that he's doing anything wrong. But now in Acts 21, they've gotten suspicions that he's teaching contrary to the law, and they want him to prove he keeps the law. And now Paul gets to show whether he has guts and courage, and he'll stand by his convictions, when you'll see he absolutely doesn't stand by them at all. All right, so now if we get back to Maccoby on page 153, he's talking about where James is telling Paul, if you do what we tell you to do, then everyone will know that there's nothing in the stories that we're told about you that you are a practicing Jew and keep the law yourself. So this is what he's being told you must do to prove what you truly represent. You truly represent a person who's keeping God's law. And Paul is definitely not keeping God's law. He says so. It's done away with. It was a tutor. It's abolished. And then Maccoby says it is much more likely that this incident, where Paul's called up to prove he's law compliant, was in the nature of an official inquiry or even a trial, and that Paul had been officially summoned to attend it in order to answer once and for all the charges now being made against him on all hands. If he failed to attend or failed to satisfy the elders having attended, they would formally have ejected him from the Nazarene movement. It seems that in the course of the inquiry, Paul refused to admit that he had advocated the abandonment of the Torah in his teaching. Consequently, James and the other elders had decided to put him on to the test, or rather to devise a procedure by which he would publicly repudiate any teaching that he might have given against the continuing validity of the Torah. The news of this public repudiation by Paul of his former views would be quickly reach his converts, and thus strengthen the hands of the emissaries from Jerusalem who were working to correct Paul's teaching. The elders were probably convinced that Paul had indeed spread an anti-Torah doctrine, but they hoped to counteract the effect of this by an exhibition of repentance on Paul's part. We find out here, my friends, what happens. Instead, Paul consents meekly to an action that reinstated the Torah. So all he had to do was say, nope, the Torah is dead and gone. It was a tutor. Don't put us in bondage anymore. You, James, all the disciples, all you apostles, you're following a false Christ. I'm the only one listening to the real Christ in this third heaven. But I can't quote you anything. That's true. That's true. I'm prohibited from saying what he says. But you know what? You just got to trust me that I'm talking to him. Stop resisting me. But Paul doesn't have these spiritual strengths or guts. He's a coward. He's a weakling, a spiritual weakling, and he does exactly opposite of what his voice in his bold words. When he writes his epistles, he's extremely bold, and I'm more important. I've done more than anybody, but I've suffered more than anyone. I've had more shipwrecks than anyone. But you know what? You don't have the guts of any of these people. And everybody says, oh, well, Paul died, though, a martyr. No, he didn't die a martyr. And that's in First Clement, the epistle of Clement, the Bishop of Rome, who said Paul died in the extremity of the west of the Roman Empire, which is Spain. And all the four myths of Paul's death in Rome were an alleged martyrdom. But Clement is what? He's the Bishop of Rome. And he says Paul died in Spain. Who better than the Bishop of Rome to know? And it was a natural death. He departed at long last out of the Spain, the extremity of the west, Spain. But he's the Bishop of Rome. He doesn't say he died there as a martyr. No, he just died a natural death. So don't give me this that he was a hero and died a martyr when there's absolute evidence, documentary evidence, First Clement, that says the opposite. And that letter had been lost for centuries, but it was found in 1626, given to just in the back of the book of the Alexandrinus Bible that dates from the 400s. And there it was, a 5-page letter of Clement to the people of Rome. There it is. He wasn't a cow. He wasn't a hero. He was a coward. That's who he really was. Paul must have been overawed by James on this occasion. See, he can't beat James. James is the heir to the throne of David because Jesus is ascended into heaven. So he would be the king of Israel if the Romans would fall. Romans who were allies of Paul, by the way. Probably, though, this is not mentioned in the account in Acts, Peter, too, took a prominent part in the inquiry, and the third leader, John, who receives only passing mention in Acts, must have been a formidable character as well. Though Paul could convince himself, when not in their presence, that he was their equal or even superior, he could not sustain this attitude to their faces. Some of the grandeur which must have surrounded James can be felt even in the record of Acts. In reality, these men had the gravity and presence of the great Pharisee teachers. He means James, James, Peter, and John. They had this gravity. Paul had none. In reality, these men had the gravity and presence of the great Pharisee teachers, such as Hillel and Gamaliel, and the parvenu, the novice. Paul could not withstand them in their own milieu. He succumbed and consented to what was in effect a recantation. So I'm just going to leave it there, my friends. Now, this was part of also the first part, but we really needed to see that underlying text of Acts 21, what was really going on, the charge of apostasy, Paul being asked to do something that would prove he was keeping the law, and he did what exactly they asked him to do, which means he's a spiritual weakling. And we need to expose that about Paul. He's not the spiritual hero of Christians. He's a spiritual weakling, because if he really believed in what he says now, later in his epistles. Actually, his epistles were already written. That's the funny thing, is Galatians already been written by this point, by the time of that Acts 21. He already wrote First Corinthians. That's the standard opinion, that he had already written these things. And it makes sense that they had to be written before he was really put in prison and couldn't really communicate anymore freely, and was interacting with people. So whatever it was, it doesn't matter. He just didn't have any guts. He was a big mouth when he talked and wrote in letters, but he was a very small person in person. He was just like he looks. In this first slide really does capture who the kind of person he is: a sly, cunning, deceiving person, willing to pretend to be, I'm a Jew. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews, as they were our subjects of the law of Moses. That is a coward. Just if you don't believe in Judaism, just say so. Just say the law has changed. There's a new covenant. Tell us what the new covenant is. It says, though, in the new covenant passage of Jeremiah, Paul, it says the law, my Torah will be, Yahweh says, my Torah will be put on their hearts. It's not going to be just on stones anymore. So it was more intimately to be known and remembered, not forgotten or abolished or removed as a tutor of the past. Paul, you didn't have guts, and if you had guts, you would have learned you're either a liar, lying to yourself, lying to us, or you are just simply biblically illiterate, that you don't even understand what the word new covenant referred to. It referred to Jeremiah 31, verse 31 and 33, where the new covenant is the Torah. My Torah will be put on your hearts. Not that it's going to be taken away. All right. And in the next episode, we're going to come back and we're going to examine, did Paul not know Hebrew at all? That's exactly what Maccoby says. He's a Jewish scholar. He knows Hebrew himself. He's saying, looking at all the quotes and the translations that Paul made, he didn't know Hebrew. He just didn't understand Hebrew. How about that? This is shockers. So we'll be back with that in the next episode. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.